with another interesting topic for today. Now, this one is a consequence of a reprinted op-ed piece written by someone named Lionel Oddendorf back in 2016 that appeared in the Cape Argus. And the reason that apparently the Independent Online chose to run this story today was because of a social media brouhaha, I don't want to say controversy, but brouhaha tied to South African singer Tyla. Tyla recently came out with a song entitled Water, and in the video, apparently, a lot of Black Americans must be watching this, and a bunch of them commented because people said Tyla's colored, and they took offense to that. Why did they take offense to that? Well, because in America, the anachronistic use of the term colored was used to refer to Black people, but it was not a racial slur. It's how Black folks identify themselves. It's how the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People continues to identify itself. It was not a racial slur. It was used by people to claim a racial slur. Now, the N-word, that's definitely a racial slur. The K-word has become a racial slur, but the term colored was not a racial slur. So, unfortunately, the mindsets of Black Americans who were very poorly informed about the origins or etymology of words and development of words, it offended their sensibilities. So apparently they took to social media to complain when people called Tyla colored. This apparently started some sort of little brouhaha that's ongoing at the very moment. So I'm going to read his op-ed, Lionel Oddendorf's op-ed from the Cape Argus. Bear in mind, this is from 2016, but I find it very illuminating. Now, this is not an attack on Lionel Oddendorf. I don't know him from Adam, and I will comment about some of the things he said here, and perhaps the entire argument is not here, but all I have to go with is this op-ed. So, again, Black Americans are taking exception to the fact that people refer to Tyla as colored. Now, before I go any further with reading the op-ed, let me just say this. Tyla has Mauritian, Zulu, Irish, and other roots. I look at her and I don't see a colored person from the standpoint of what I recognize and have come to know as colored peoples in South Africa. She is, to me, mixed race. And that's what we call it in America, as we call it Zimbabwe and Botswana. When someone has a white parent, a Black parent, they're mixed race. So I'm not trying to identify her. That's her place to identify herself. That's her choice. I'm just trying to say that the controversy is a bit silly. She doesn't even look to be someone of, now I believe she has some Malay descent. So if she has Malay descent, then she would be, excuse me, considered part of the colored community. Or if she wants to identify as part of the colored community, that's her prerogative. But let's just get into this story here. So, excuse me. Again, this appeared in the Cape Argus in 2016. I'm going to read excerpts of it, a fair portion of it if we have time. Now, this is what Lionel Oddendorf had to say in 2016. These are his words. I'm quoting before any hate wankers come on here and go, oh, who are you? You're a racist. No. Dude, I'm reading an op-ed and I'm going to comment on it. And I quote, "There has never been a race called colored. There is no colored culture, no colored traditions, and no colored customs, and therefore no colored people." Ouch. Well, first off, race is an artificial sociological construction. It has no bearing any way whatsoever in the reproduction and the continuation of the species known as Homo sapiens. So, stop with the nonsense. However, color is an ethnic identification. It's an identification, and it is akin to being English. How? They don't look at all alike. Well, you don't have to look like somebody to have a similar sort of origin. The English didn't appear as a tribe. There were no English. The English are a consequence of the merging of different groups of people who invaded the British Isles and pushed aside the indigenous. There's no such thing as indigenous. That's ludicrous. Nobody's indigenous anywhere. But indigenous population, the Celtic population of England, was pushed aside by the groups that became the English. That would include Germanic tribes like the Angles and the Saxons, and then, of course, Norse, who also invaded from the north, Danes, and others who came to the British Isles and formed an identity that eventually became known as English. And the English language developed out of that Germanic language. It was heavily influenced by Latin and, of course, by French, even more so by French than Latin. But that's how English came about. It was an amalgamation of an identity, an ethnic identity, not a racial identity, an ethnic identity based on historical development and people coming together and becoming a group. And it's the same thing with coloreds, whether it's the Cape Malays, it's the Orlums, the Nama, the Rehoboth Basters, the Griquas, take your choice. The people who identify as colored in South Africa are consequence of the merging of peoples. Now, I will take exception to some of what Mr. Oddendorf wrote in here because it seems very clear based on his op-ed. If I'm reading him wrong, he's welcome to come on my program and we can discuss it. But based on his op-ed, it seems very clear that he doesn't like white people and that he ignores the contributions of whites to the ethnic blend that is the colored South African, preferring instead simply to refer to Malays and Khoi and San as if that was the creation of the coloreds. The coloreds is creation of a mix of all these peoples, and I'm going to talk about that. All right, it's time to read the op-ed. Here we go. So that was his first paragraph. He said, these are hard truths that those who consider themselves colored need to accept, that there's no colored culture, there's no colored traditions, no language, anything. There's nothing colored. It's just made up. So, and he says here, denying this or fighting this unfortunate reality would only strengthen apartheid's hold on them, as this will mean they accept their the dominance and legitimacy of apartheid over their identity, their plight, and their destiny. Well, I think in 2016, when you wrote this, you're pretty obsessed by apartheid, which had ended at that point over 20 years prior. You need to let go and move on. I'm not going to sit here and adjudicate Oliver Cromwell kidnapping and enslaving Irish boys and girls in the Caribbean starting in the 1650s. That's just ludicrous. Nor will I demand my family's land in Germany that was taken as a consequence of conquest. It's just ludicrous. So you need to move on, Mr. Oddendorf. And you're factually incorrect. You're factually incorrect. To say that denying this or fight that they're not colored or fighting this unfortunate reality would only strengthen apartheid's hold on them, that's nonsense. Colored peoples of Southern Africa fought against racial oppression and exclusion for centuries before the institution of apartheid even existed. And to ignore that is historically dishonest. It's intellectually dishonest, and it also suits your narrative to destroy the identity of the colored people of South Africa. What's ironic about this op-ed is that this gentleman is seeking to attack an identity, which he calls a race. It's not a race, no such thing as race, colored. He's trying to attack an identity that people self-identify as by promoting other identities. And I'll get to that. Well, actually, let me get into that right now. He says it later in here, but let me just get to it right now while it's fresh in my mind. So, what am I? What am I, folks? What am I? Am I black? Am I white? Am I pink? Am I Indian? Am I Asian? What am I? Well, DNA-wise and ethnically, I'm of European origin. Most recently, of course, before that, the Caucasus, and before that, Africa. But, I don't know my ancestors 140,000 years ago, so I'll have to just trust that's where they came from, based on the DNA evidence and the archaeological evidence. But more recently, what am I? Well, I'm an American, born in America, raised in America, defended this country, and protected the world for 36 years in uniform. But more importantly, what does that mean? Growing up, I lived in a housing project where 300 families were. 3 of them were white. I never even identified as white or even noticed the difference between myself and my neighbor Goody when we played ball every day. We were friends until his teenage brother assaulted us, threw me to the ground, pinned me down as a little boy to my shoulders, and pulled a switchblade and ran across my throat, threatening to kill me because I was white. It was then that I'm like, oh, there's a difference. I noticed it. Only when troublemakers cause problem. When I lived in a housing project in Buffalo, New York, I never focused on the fact that my skin color was white and everyone else was olive because they were Puerto Rican and came from the Caribbean. That wasn't my focus. I didn't care about that as a child. So what does it mean to be white? I guess that makes me white. What does it mean? Well, I didn't grow up with anybody telling me my family's heritage, my origins. I grew up with traditions that were entirely ethnically American traditions. Things like Christmas traditions, things like Thanksgiving, celebrating the origins and the birth of this country and its traditions and its mores and its values. American football, basketball, all the things that are American, quintessentially American, and all the things that became quintessentially American, which came to us from other ethnic groups. Cotillion, from the Spanish, the Catholic Spanish. That's very much an American thing. Kindergarten, which the Germans brought to us, very much a Germanic contribution to our country. We use the word safari, which came to us from Swahili, all becomes very much part of an American tapestry and I think identity. But I didn't grow up being told that, well, you're Xhosa, you're Zulu, you're Basta. No. I grew up just knowing I was an American and being proud of my heritage. It was only as I became an adult that I became interested in my ethnic origins and my genealogy, because as a historian, I found it fascinating. Researching my ethnic origins back in the day before there was internet, going to family history libraries and looking at microfilm and archives and traveling all over the country and around the world to find this information, I discovered, of course, what I suspected to be true, that my ancestors were largely Northern European, Celtic, Irish, Scots, a bit of Welsh, English, Anglo-Saxon, of course, Norman, German, Swiss, Swedish, Norwegian, all of that. All of those people contributed to what led to my birth and my existence on this planet. Now, if you call me white, Mr. Oddendorf, does that negate all of that ethnic origin? Should I ignore my Swiss origins, which go back to 1760s when they immigrated to America, and just ignore that I have Swiss origins? Is that what I should do? Or are you advocating that I should identify solely as Swiss? But in my case, it gets more complicated. Do I identify as Swiss? Do I identify as Swedish, Norse, Frisian, German, Anglo-Saxon, Welsh, Irish? What do I identify as? It's just silly. All right, let's continue on with this. Subscribing to the colored tag also celebrates as vicious the attempts of the architects of apartheid to make people feel inferior, to determine their cultural destiny, and, to in a programmed way, question themselves and accept what is enforced upon them. So the Griquas, the Orlums, or Nama, the Rehoboth Basters, they feel inferior. They feel subjugated because someone grouped them under the grouping identity known as colored. Really? I don't know. The Rehoboth Basters that I've met are quite proud of who they are. The Griquas, whom I've associated with, are quite proud of being of Griqua origin. And they have no issue, the ones I've met, being called colored. It's a loose grouping of people who share cultural ties. Those who consider themselves colored have obviously not yet been liberated from the apartheid yoke. Now, Mr. Oddendorf, I think you're the one who hasn't been liberated from the apartheid yoke. It's deep in your mind. Much like Trump derangement syndrome sits in the minds of the politically inept and incompetent and uninformed in America, this sort of apartheid yoke sits in Mr. Oddendorf's mind. You're the one. You're the one who has it stuck in your head. 30 years after the end of apartheid, it's still, will you be still preaching the same line 300 years from now if we somehow find the Fountain of Youth from Ponce de Leon to give you a chance to live 300 years? More than that, it dishonors the struggles of those who fought against apartheid, died in their struggle against the evil system that denied people their identity, rights, and land. Horsemanure. Horsemanure. As I said, colored South Africans fought against racial oppression and racial segregation for centuries before the existence of apartheid. The idea of being colored predated apartheid. He wants to claim exclusively a apartheid creation, but even if it was an apartheid creation, it has been embraced by millions of coloreds in South Africa, in Namibia, and neighboring states. They identify as colored, and proudly so, adopting the traditions of the Cape Malay slaves, adopting the traditions of Khoisan San, of the Strandlopers, and of other groups, including Europeans. Here's where he puts facts in. Fact is, when the Population Registration Act was enacted in 1950, it simply defined a colored person as a person who is not a white person or a native. Well, the fact that the bigots created that act in 1950 doesn't obviate or negate the fact that coloreds exist in South Africa and have existed for centuries. Accordingly, as the late First Lady Marieke de Klerk, raped and murdered in her home, by the way, said in 1983 when she wasn't the First Lady, they are the people that were left after the nations were sorted out. They are the rest. Well, that's an unfortunate comment, but what I infer from that comment is that there was no nation of coloreds. There were multiple subgroupings of it, the Griquas, the Rehoboth Basters, the Orlums, the Namas, all those different groups, the Cape Malays, all those groups, and someone came with an overarching term that described them. But that's your basis for saying there's no such thing as colored? Silly. Colored, therefore, became the collective name for all those who are not white or native. Well, nobody was native except the Khoisan. Now, he does go on to acknowledge groups I mentioned here. It also includes various subgroups such as Cape Colored, Cape Malay, the Griqua, Nama, and other colored. So he does recognize them, but he has issues with those groups also identifying as colored. I identify as American, but also identify of German descent, of Irish descent, of Norse descent. That's why I call myself a Viking. Tweede Nuvia, like pickled fish over Easter, is not part of the colored culture. It finds its origins in Cape slave culture, which is a group that identifies as part of the colored community. So their traditions come along. So with that logic, does that mean that I can't consider kindergarten to be part of my heritage as an American? I didn't invent it. It came from Germans. They brought it here. We accepted and adopted and made it part of us. Does that mean that the Herero of Namibia should throw away their traditional Victorian dress because they didn't invent it? It was brought there, introduced by German missionaries. They adopted it and it became part. Nobody in Germany wears Victorian clothing these days. Nobody. It's not even, maybe for a play. But the Herero wear Victorian dresses, and they dress up very elaborately in such painful and choking and warm clothing in the desert. Faith in Bogui Bosi, I can't pronounce that, and other traditional herbs, leaves, and roots as coloreds in warriors still trust is not part of colored culture. It finds its origins in Khoisan traditions. Duh. Now, this is nonsense. This is just total nonsense. So, Christianity and Islam were not part of Cape Malay culture. Well, Islam was, excuse me. But Christianity and Islam were introduced into South Africa. The Malays brought Islam, and the Europeans brought Christianity. And that is part of virtually all colored groupings, subgroupings. So do we have to abandon that? That's not a colored tradition, being Islamic or being Christian. The attachment to the sea and maritime resources are not part of the colored culture. It is part of the Strandloper culture. See, now here's the problem I have with this. The reason we have coloreds is because of the arrival of Europeans who brought slaves from Malay and who brought European DNA to Africa and mixed with Khoi and San and Malay and others, and Golans later on and others. They have a maritime tradition. This is an extremely arrogant, bigoted op-ed by Mr. Oddendorf. He confuses the origins of the so-called coloreds, which include Europeans, and a very significant percentage of the admixture of the so-called color groups includes Europeans, Germans, Dutch, Portuguese, and French. And of course, the maritime origins and the attachment to the sea come from the Dutch. So to deny that is just bigotry and factually incorrect, Mr. Oddendorf. It's a shame that you see everything through a lens of race. Then he says that's a notorious apartheid statute that created the colored and denied the descendants of slaves, the Griquadanam, descendants of the Khoi and the San, their existence, stripped them of their heritage, and reduced their cultures and traditions to nothing. You know, it's funny you say that. I'm an American. I'm not South African, but I know the history of the Orlums of the Nama. I know the history of the Rehoboth Basters, a proud history. I know the story of Janke Afrikaner and the story of Adam Kok and Kokstad in the Griquas. I know that, and millions of South Africans know that. So who's denying their existence? Yes, apartheid may have suppressed ethnic identities, but that's not an excuse for obviating the concept of a colored identity. That's just idiotic. He said, second, society accepted colored as the legitimate name and false identity for different and diverse groups of people who had little in common, and today, sadly, many people who have been stripped of all that define them, reject who they really are, and accept what apartheid wanted them to be. Really? So we didn't have apartheid here. There was racial exclusion, but we didn't have apartheid. I didn't grow up in apartheid. Did the system force me to abandon my ethnic origins? No. The people who came before me abandoned the things that they didn't find appealing from their ethnic origins and merged into a culture here that developed into Americans. That's right. With cotillion, with kindergarten, with lutefisk, with all the things that make us Americans. It's an amalgamation of cultures to form an ethnic identity. As simple as that. And it's the same with colors. This newfound yet wrong colored self-identification is dangerous because it's premised on irresponsible and short-sighted apartheid dogma. No, it's not. It's premised on a group of people accepting something they want to be and identifying such. How is it today that people can self-identify as trees or, z, zer, zem, zis, zat, zat, zoo, and whatever sexuality they desire? That's perfectly okay. Now, to be fair, he wrote this in 2016, but it's not okay for people to identify as colored. Why can't they identify as colored if they want to be colored? That's their prerogative. He said it's also restricting many from self-exploration about who and what they really are. But then again, perhaps it's the emotionally safe thing to do. Well, Mr. Lionel Oddendorf, as I've said several times in this stream, I was not restricted from finding my ethnic identity, and I spent thousands of dollars doing so because it interested me. And I even did DNA to check into it and find missing gaps in my history. Anyone's perfectly capable to do that. No one's preventing anyone from that. And it's up to the groups, the Griquas, the Rehoboth Basters, the Orlums, who are now Nama. All these groups indicate Malays to, there's a whole Kapsa language that people speak in the Western Cape. They protect and guard that language. So he said, colored people need a second liberation because being colored is the veil over one's Malay heritage or Khoisan ancestry. Again, this is very bigoted and perhaps even bordering on racist. One's Malay or Khoisan ancestry. What about their Dutch, their German, their French ancestry? What about that? Funny how you don't mention that. This new epic probably provides the best opportunity for these different communities packaged into one to reassert themselves and to investigate their own heritage and ancestry. Now, the whole thing is just horse shit. And I'll say that right now, this whole op-ed, because it takes colored and identifies as a racial grouping, but says nothing about white. Do you think whites are simply the arrival of the Dutch? Seriously, you think all South Africans who are Afrikaner or white South Africans, English speakers, are Dutch origin? No. They're Portuguese, German, French, Huguenots, Dutch, English, and many other nationalities who arrived. Greeks who arrived there, Jews who arrived there. Many people who are part of the so-called white community in South Africa come from ethnic melange, mixed together, particularly the Afrikaners. If you look at the DNA of an Afrikaner, the vast majority of Afrikaners have as much as 9% African DNA. Not to mention the largest admixture in the Afrikaner DNA pool, if such a thing exists, is German, not Dutch. That's second. German is the overwhelming portion of it. So what about black South Africans? Calling them black, does that obviate or negate the fact that people are Xhosa, Tswana, Zulu, Venda, Sotho? No, it doesn't. This is stupid. This is stupid. This is hating on coloreds. It hates coloreds. It's a shameful thing. I don't know if Mr. Oddendorf is an Afrikaner or if he's colored based on his name, Lionel Oddendorf. I would guess he's one of the two, but that could be a false assumption, much like his op-ed. So it's, yeah, anyway. There are many who have been too consumed by their coloredness that they had little time to discover and celebrate their Khoisanness or their Malayness or even their Angolaness. What about their Frenchness, their Germanness, or their Dutchness? It's just stupid, silly stuff. Assaulting coloreds. This new liberation struggle must defeat the last remnants of apartheid and its cruel hold on those considered to be colored, and nationally colored people should be able to identify themselves according to how they came here or as to what they were found here. Yeah, okay. Thank you for that. The struggle against apartheid is in your head, Mr. Oddendorf, and the Independent Online for running this op-ed from 2016, 7 years ago. Why are you running this op-ed? It has nothing to do with Tyla. You know, in fact, as I look at her as a person knowing South Africa's history, knowing the etymology of words, knowing the history of language, knowing the cultural organization of South Africa, I look at her and see a lady who is mixed race in the modern sense. If she has Malay descent, then fine. It's her prerogative to call herself colored. Growing up in Johannesburg, not exactly a bastion of colored culture, and not exactly the location where colored groups are from. There are some there. Anyway. So he goes on with other stupid asinine things. When the Population Registration Act was repealed 25 years ago, this is in 2016, we were fooled by then President F.W. de Klerk. Really? How did he fool you? As recent events showed, when he declared to a joint sitting of the House of Assembly, the House of Representatives and the House of Delegates, three different bodies for three different groups, coloreds, whites, and Indians. Now everybody is free from the discouragement and denial and from the moral dilemma caused by this legislation. In fact, that is the case. How were you misled by F.W. de Klerk? 25 years later, colored people continue to suffer the severe consequences of this legislation. Denial of the true self, suppressed since colonialism, and denied by apartheid. If you want to argue that colored groups in South Africa are disproportionately poor or disproportionately victims of crime, make your case. That's fine. That's acceptable. But they're being oppressed by an identity? This is childish. These different communities deserve identities that truly reflect their heritage. Of course, he's trying to erase the colored identity, which is something that people coalesced around. And in fact, it formed a basis for opposition to apartheid during the apartheid era. And as I've said, colored groups fought against racial exclusion for hundreds of years before apartheid. So he's trying to obviate, negate, erase the colored identity because it hurts his feelings. He's bum-hurt that people call themselves colored because they don't know their Khoi origins. Well, do they know their Dutch origins? Do they know their French Huguenot origins? Go to the Huguenot Museum in Franschhoek. There is a panel with people descended from one of the original Huguenots who was there. It includes Peter de Villiers. He's colored. Must he exclusively focus on his Khoi, San, or Malay origins? Or is he allowed to celebrate the heritage of his Dutch origins? Not according to Mr. Oddendorf. The Dutch, the Germans, the French Huguenots had no contribution. They were just oppressors. The people who are the descendants of those people somehow must deny that DNA and that ethnicity, that origin. This is ridiculous. Ridiculous. Yeah, Lionel Oddendorf is a former journalist and a member of the Western Cape executive of the African National Congress. Well, there you go. There you go. That's all I need to know. Race hustling in the African National Congress. Mr. Oddendorf, I'd be happy to talk to you about this. And why is it you feel that it's okay to negate the identity of colored and associate exclusively with apartheid when it predates that? The term may not have been there in the fashion is today. He even negates the Afrikaans language. Let me find with that. Somewhere he negates the Afrikaans language somewhere here. I missed that entirely in my reading of this. My fingers are getting numb out here in this cold temperature. Where's that at? Somewhere he negates that. Oh, come on. Where's this thing at? But he says that the Afrikaans language is not even, Oh, there it is. Speaking Afrikaans is not part of being colored because the language was created by the slaves. Untrue. It's a Creole that slaves propagated. It wasn't created by the slaves. Prefected by the Muslim scholars. Those are the people who wrote it down, and hijacked by the Afrikaners in 1875. This is comical. So when it suits your need, Mr. Oddendorf, Afrikaans is an oppressive language, the language of apartheid. But right here in his op-ed, Mr. Oddendorf negates all the race lies told by the ANC and by the EFF and all race hustlers in South Africa, completely obliterating it by admitting that it was Malay slaves who formed the Creole. It was Muslim scholars who wrote it down, but the Afrikaners hijacked it in 1875. Well, apartheid appeared in 1948, and if you want to stretch it and go back to Union South Africa, the first time it became a country, that wasn't until 1910. This is 1875. That's 35 years prior to that. So anyway, but it suits the needs of race hustlers to call apartheid an oppressive language when they want to attack white South Africans. It also suits them it's an oppressive language when they claim that white South Africans stole the language. It's sad, folks. It's sad. This is all coming, of course, because Tyla's single "Water." If you haven't heard, it's a beautiful song. And so anyway, so you go watch it. It's available on Vivo and YouTube, other places you can go watch your video. And interesting. It's kind of sexually suggestive. So if you got sensibilities, you don't want to watch that. Anyway, folks, I'm going to wrap it up here and just say that this is all a bunch of drivel. If people want to identify as colored, that's their prerogative. It's not a legacy of apartheid. The origins of many peoples come from times of difficulty. The Serbs considered the birth of their nation a battle that took place in the Kosovo Plogi in the year 1389, when the cream of their intelligentsia, their nobility, was wiped out. 30,000 Serbs obliterated in a battle with the Turks in 1389. The Serbs considered that the birth of their nation, a time when they lost their ass. Cultural identities, ethnic identities can be born out of difficult times. And if South Africans who are colored consider themselves colored, and if the term was first applied during apartheid, so what? No one's oppressed. It's self-identification. Foot sec. Piss off with your nonsense and your race hustling. We're sick of it. Colored South Africans should be proud of who they are. Those who speak Kapsa should be proud of who they are. Those who are of Cape Malay descent, who are Muslim, who are Christian, of Dutch, of Khoisan descent, the Griquas, the Rehoboth Bastards, the Nama, or Orlams. Be proud of who you are. And if you want to identify that as a subgrouping, as I do identify of German and Irish heritage, while still being an American ethnicity on top, you can do the same. That's your prerogative. And don't let anyone tell you anything else, especially race hustlers. Thanks, folks. We'll be going live with the news here in just a few minutes. Looks like the rain is picking up. It's going to be a very bad day for my solar generation. It's a overcast day. Cheers, everybody. Thank you so much. Be sure to hit the like button, and we'll catch you on the news here in just a couple minutes. Cheers.